In this extraordinary story, a retired Marine reunites with his loyal war dog after a decade apart, but the night takes an unexpected turn when the dog's instincts save the day. How did this incredible reunion lead to a heroic act that stunned everyone watching? Join us as we explore this incredible story of gratitude, healing, and second chances. Don't forget to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our amazing community. Daniel Morris sat at his kitchen table, the ticking clock on the wall behind him marking the seconds of another restless night. He rubbed his temples, his hands calloused from years of service as a Marine. The coffee in his mug had gone cold, untouched, as his thoughts drifted to a time and place far removed from the small, quiet town he now called home. A decade had passed since his last deployment in Iraq, but the memories of the battlefield felt as vivid as yesterday. The ringing in his ears from roadside explosions, the hum of the Humvee's engine, and the sharp bark of his partner, Max, his military working dog, echoed in his mind. Daniel often thought of Max, the German shepherd who had saved his life more times than he cared to count. The bond they shared had been unshakable, forged in the crucible of war. But when their deployment ended, Daniel was reassigned stateside, and Max was given to another handler. It wasn't a choice, it was protocol. Still, the loss felt personal, a void that hadn't been filled since. The transition to civilian life had been harder than Daniel expected. He had exchanged the chaos of war for the stillness of his small-town home, but the quiet was anything but peaceful. Nights were long, haunted by nightmares, and the days dragged on, one blending into the next. The camaraderie of his platoon had been replaced by isolation. People in town thanked him for his service, but their words felt hollow. They couldn't understand what it was like to carry the weight of lives saved and lost. On the counter sat a stack of unpaid bills, a reminder of how difficult it was to find steady work. Daniel had tried his hand at construction, then warehouse jobs, but his body, worn from years of service, couldn't keep up with the demands. He had even dabbled in carpentry, building small furniture pieces to sell online, but the income was inconsistent at best. His heart wasn't in it. It wasn't in much these days. As Daniel scrolled aimlessly through his phone, a headline caught his eye: "Retired military working dogs available for adoption." His thumb hovered over the article. It was a news story about how retired war dogs, having served their duty, were often placed in shelters or with families if their handlers couldn't take them. He hesitated, a pang of guilt settling in his chest. Over the years he had tried to follow Max's journey, reaching out to old contacts in the military. The trail went cold after his second handler retired. No one seemed to know or care what had happened to Max. He clicked the article anyway, scrolling through photos of dogs with worn faces but alert eyes. They looked like soldiers in their own right, their age and scars telling stories of service and sacrifice. He wondered if Max was out there somewhere, waiting for a home. The thought was fleeting. He had spent years searching, and it had always led to dead ends. But the next day, fate intervened. Daniel's phone buzzed with a text from an old Marine buddy, Rick. The two hadn't spoken in years, but Rick's message was simple and direct. "Daniel, I think I found Max. Shelter in Fort Ridge. You need to check this out." His chest tightened as he read the words. He stared at the screen, his hands trembling slightly. Could it really be Max? The odds were slim, but Rick wouldn't joke about something like this. He knew what Max had meant to Daniel. Without hesitation, Daniel grabbed his keys, ignoring the pile of bills and the half-finished projects in his garage. This wasn't just a dog. This was Max, his partner, his lifeline during the darkest days of his life. The drive to Fort Ridge was an hour long, but to Daniel it felt like days. His mind raced with questions. Would Max remember him? Had he aged well, or would he even recognize the dog he had trained and trusted with his life? And what if it wasn't Max at all? He pushed the doubts aside, gripping the steering wheel tighter. He couldn't let himself think that way. As he pulled into the gravel parking lot of the Fort Ridge Animal Shelter, his stomach churned with nerves. The shelter was small, unassuming, with a faded sign that read, "Giving Second Chances." He stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching against the gravel, and took a deep breath to steady himself. Inside, a woman at the front desk greeted him with a warm smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm looking for a dog," Daniel said, his voice steadier than he felt. "His name is Max. I think he might be here." The woman's expression softened. "Max," she repeated, nodding slowly. "He's been with us for a few weeks now. Came in after his last owner passed away. He's special." Daniel's heart raced as she led him through a hallway lined with kennels. The sound of barking and whining filled the air, but Daniel barely noticed. Then, at the far end of the hall, he saw him. A German shepherd with a coat that had grayed around the muzzle, but eyes that were sharp, searching. "Max," Daniel whispered, his voice cracking. The dog tilted his head, his ears perking up at the sound of his name. But there was hesitation in Max's movements, a glimmer of recognition, clouded by time and distance. Daniel dropped to one knee, tears welling in his eyes. "It's me, buddy," he said, his voice trembling. "It's Daniel." For a moment Max remained still, his body tense. Then slowly he took a cautious step forward, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Recognition dawned in his eyes, and his tail began to wag. A slow, hesitant motion that quickly became a joyous frenzy. Daniel laughed through his tears as Max pressed his head into his chest, the bond between them reigniting as if no time had passed at all. The woman at the shelter stood back, watching the reunion with a smile. "We've got cameras here," she said softly. "I think this is something worth recording." And she was right. Daniel remained on his knees, his arms wrapped tightly around Max's neck, feeling the warm fur beneath his fingers. He buried his face into the dog's coat, breathing in the faint scent of cedar chips and dog shampoo. It was Max. There was no doubt now. The way Max leaned into him, pressing his weight as if to say, "I've missed you too," dissolved the years of separation in an instant. It was. "Look at you," Daniel whispered, pulling back slightly to take in the dog's familiar face. Max's muzzle had grayed over the years, and there were subtle scars near his ears that Daniel didn't remember. But his deep brown eyes, intelligent and filled with emotion, were exactly the same. They had always been Max's most striking feature. The eyes of a protector and friend. Max let out a soft whine, licking Daniel's face eagerly, his tail wagging so hard it thumped against the kennel wall. Daniel laughed, a sound he hadn't heard from himself in years, and cupped Max's face in his hands. "You haven't changed a bit," he said. "Still the same goofball who'd wag his tail in the middle of a firefight." The shelter worker, whose name tag read Megan, stood nearby, watching with a warm smile. "This is incredible," she said softly. "He's been here for a few weeks, but I've never seen him this excited. He's usually so reserved." Daniel looked up at her, still holding on to Max, as if afraid to let go. "Reserved? That doesn't sound like the Max I knew." Her glance was affectatious, as if she were talking to. Megan shrugged, stepping closer. "When he first came to us, he was pretty shut down. We learned he'd been with an older gentleman, his last handler, who passed away. After that, Max was surrendered here. He wasn't aggressive or anything, just distant, like he was waiting for someone." "Waiting for me," Daniel said, the realization hitting him hard. Megan nodded. "Maybe. Dogs like him, military working dogs, they form bonds that go deeper than most people realize. When that bond is broken..." She hesitated, searching for the right words. "Well, they don't always recover, but Max seems different now." Daniel scratched behind Max's ears, and the dog leaned into his touch, eyes closing in bliss. "I owe him everything," Daniel said, his voice heavy with emotion. "He saved my life more times than I can count." Megan gave him a curious look. "Really? What's his story?" "I can be a natural." Daniel hesitated, the memories rushing back like a flood. "We served together in Iraq. Max was trained to detect explosives, and he was the best. He saved my squad from IEDs more times than I can remember. But it wasn't just that. In a place where every corner could mean death, he was my anchor. He kept me grounded." Megan's eyes softened. "It sounds like you were more than just handler and dog." "Oh, I was." Daniel nodded. "He wasn't just a dog. He was my partner, my lifeline." Megan smiled. "Well, it looks like he still thinks of you that way." "What is what?" "If somebody comes here, the last thing you want?" She opened the kennel door, and Max trotted out, his tail still wagging as he pressed closer to Daniel. Daniel stood, his knees aching slightly, and placed a hand on Max's back, feeling the strength that hadn't diminished with time. Megan's smile widened. "I had a feeling you'd say that. Let's get the paperwork started." She rose. "I have a confusion." As they walked back toward the front desk, Max stayed glued to Daniel's side, his head brushing against Daniel's leg with every step. Other dogs barked from their kennels, but Max ignored them, his focus solely on his long-lost handler. It was as if the 10 years apart had never happened. At the desk, Megan handed Daniel a clipboard. "He's up to date on his vaccinations, and we've got his medical records here. He's in good health, though he's a little older now, around 12. Daniel nodded as he scanned the forms. 12, he murmured. "He was just a pup when we were deployed, barely 2 years old." As he filled out the forms, Megan leaned against the counter. "You know, we've got security cameras here, and I was watching the reunion from the office. It was moving, to say the least. You could feel the connection between you two." Daniel chuckled. "You caught all that on tape?" "Every second," Megan said. "I think people need to see it, the bond between veterans and their dogs. It's powerful." Daniel hesitated, but then nodded. "If it helps people understand how important these dogs are, go ahead. Max deserves to be recognized for what he's done." When the paperwork was finished, Megan handed Daniel Max's leash. "He's officially yours," she said. "Welcome home, Max." His legs tightened rapidly, but he shrugged. As they walked out of the shelter together, Daniel felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. Max trotted beside him, his tail wagging, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt a glimmer of hope. Before they reached the truck, Daniel knelt down beside Max and placed a hand on his chest. "You're home now," he said softly. "And I promise, I'll take care of you, just like you took care of me." Max let out a low bark, as if in agreement, and nuzzled Daniel's face. The sun was setting as they drove home, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Daniel glanced at Max, who sat in the passenger seat, his ears perked up and his eyes scanning the horizon. It felt like a new chapter, one where neither of them would have to face the world alone again. The first night with Max back home was quieter than Daniel had expected. The two settled into a rhythm almost immediately, as if their time apart hadn't been a decade. Max followed Daniel everywhere in the house, his claws clicking softly on the wooden floors. When Daniel sat at the table to work on a small carpentry project, Max curled up at his feet. It felt right. For the first time in years, the house didn't seem so empty. Later that evening, Daniel prepared a modest dinner, grilled chicken and rice, with a small portion set aside for Max. "We used to eat out of MREs, Daniel said, scratching Max behind the ears as he set the bowl down. "Bet this tastes a hell of a lot better, huh?" Max wolfed down his food, his tail thumping against the kitchen cabinets. Daniel smiled. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this at ease. As night fell, he locked the doors, checked the windows, a habit from both his military days and his ongoing struggle with paranoia, and settled into the worn couch. Max hopped up beside him, resting his head on Daniel's knee. The calm didn't last long. It was past midnight when Max's ears perked up. Daniel was half asleep, the television playing some late-night documentary he wasn't really watching, but Max's sudden alertness jolted him awake. The dog's body went rigid, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Then came the low growl, deep and guttural, rumbling from Max's chest. "What is it, boy?" Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. Max jumped off the couch, his body tense, and moved toward the front door. Daniel's heart raced as he sat up, adrenaline kicking in. Years of combat had taught him to trust his instincts. And Max. He grabbed the baseball bat he kept behind the couch, his eyes scanning the dimly lit room. The quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound, but Max's behavior told him something wasn't right. Then came the faint creak of a floorboard. Daniel froze. The door cracked open, and Alex came in. Someone was in the house. Max barked sharply, the sound echoing through the room, and charged toward the hallway. Daniel followed, gripping the bat tightly. His breathing was steady, but his pulse was pounding in his ears. He moved with practiced precision, flipping the light switch as he stepped into the hallway. Two shadows loomed near the back door, which was slightly ajar. The intruders, men in dark clothing and ski masks, froze as the light flooded the room. For a split second, no one moved. Then Max lunged. The larger of the two men reacted first, raising his arm to block Max's charge, but the dog was too fast. Max clamped his jaws around the man's arm, shaking it violently as the intruder screamed. The second man stumbled backward, fumbling with something in his pocket. A knife, Daniel realized. "Back off!" Daniel shouted, his voice commanding as he stepped forward with the bat. His years of training took over. "Get out of my house!" The second man hesitated, clearly unsure whether to fight or run. Max released the first intruder's arm just long enough to reposition, his teeth now gripping the man's jacket. The sound of fabric tearing filled the room as the intruder tried to shake Max off, but the dog's grip was unyielding. The man with the knife made his move, lunging toward Max. Without thinking, Daniel swung the bat, the crack of wood against bone reverberating through the hallway. The man dropped the knife, clutching his arm with a pained grunt. "That's enough," Daniel growled, his voice filled with the same authority he had used to command troops. "Leave now, or the next one won't be a warning." The men exchanged a panicked glance before stumbling toward the door. Max snapped at their heels, ensuring their retreat was hasty. Within seconds they were gone, the sound of their hurried footsteps fading into the night. Daniel locked the door and leaned against it, his chest heaving. Max stood beside him, his tail wagging slightly, as if to say, "We did it." The sound of Max fussing with the communications kit made Max feel a little better. But his depression did not quiet. The silence on the road came to a head. "You're incredible, you know that?" Daniel said, dropping to one knee to ruffle Max's fur. The dog licked his face, his demeanor shifting back to the playful companion Daniel knew so well. But the bite marks and scraps of fabric clinging to Max's teeth were a stark reminder of how fiercely protective he could be when it mattered, and Max grabbed a breather from the lowest rack. He sucked 3 times before getting up and wiping the dust off his mouth. Daniel glanced at the security camera mounted in the corner of the hallway. He had installed it years ago as a precaution, though he had rarely used it. Now he was grateful it had been recording. He tapped the button on his phone to stop the feed and played back the footage, watching in awe as Max's actions unfolded on the small screen. The dog's precision and bravery were astonishing. He had moved with the same discipline Daniel remembered from their days in Iraq, using calculated aggression to neutralize the threat without hesitation. It wasn't just instinct, it was training. Training that had never left him, even after all these years. As the footage ended, Daniel felt a swell of pride. "You're a hero, Max," he said quietly. "You always have been." The adrenaline was wearing off now, and the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. Daniel knew he needed to call the police, file a report, and provide them with the security footage. But for now, he just sat on the floor with Max, scratching the dog's ears and letting the reality of the moment settle. For the first time in years, Daniel didn't feel alone. Max wasn't just his war dog or his pet. He was his partner, his protector, and his second chance at a life that felt meaningful again. The police arrived within 20 minutes, their flashing lights cutting through the stillness of the early morning. 2 officers stepped out of the cruiser, one older with a weathered face and a no-nonsense demeanor, the other younger, looking slightly uneasy as they approached Daniel's front porch. Daniel opened the door, Max standing alertly by his side. "Come in," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I've got the footage ready for you." He closed the door to the room and the cops came in. The lights were off. The older officer, Sergeant Williams, glanced at Max and raised an eyebrow. "This the hero?" he asked. Daniel nodded, giving Max an affectionate pat on the head. "Yeah, he's the reason I'm standing here talking to you." Williams crouched slightly, extending a hand toward Max. The dog sniffed it cautiously before allowing a few pats on his head. "Good dog?" Williams said, then stood. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Inside, Daniel pulled up the security footage on his laptop. The officers leaned in, their expressions growing more intense as they watched the events unfold. Max's swift takedown of the first intruder, Daniel's commanding intervention, and the chaotic scramble that followed played out on the screen with stunning clarity. "Unbelievable," the younger officer, Carter, muttered under his breath. "This dog's like something out of a movie." "He's a retired military working dog," Daniel explained. "We served together in Iraq. He was trained for situations like this." Williams leaned back, arms crossed. "Trained or not, this is remarkable. He didn't just attack. They were calculated moves. Controlled. He's not just protecting. He's strategizing." Daniel nodded, pride swelling in his chest. "That's Max. Always thinking 2 steps ahead." The officers exchanged a glance before Williams spoke again. "You've got a solid case here. Between the footage and your testimony, it'll be hard for those guys to claim innocence. We'll circulate this to nearby precincts and see if anyone recognizes them." "What happens next?" Daniel asked, his tone steady. "We'll log this as a home invasion and send a report to the DA. If they're caught, you'll likely need to testify in court. In the meantime, it wouldn't hurt to beef up your security system." Daniel gestured toward Max. "I think I've got the best system there is." Williams chuckled. "Can't argue with that." The officers wrapped up their investigation, taking copies of the footage and snapping photos of the door where the intruders had broken in. As they left, Carter paused on the porch, glancing back at Max. "Hey," he said, almost shyly, "if more people had dogs like him, I think my job would be a lot easier." Daniel smiled. "Yeah, but they'd have to earn him first." Another. As the police cruiser pulled away, the neighborhood began to wake up. The faint sound of birds chirping replaced the adrenaline-charged silence of the night. Daniel sat on the porch steps, Max lying beside him, his head resting on Daniel's knee. "You did good, buddy," Daniel said softly. Max responded with a soft thump of his tail. Later that day, Daniel decided to share the security footage with the shelter where he had adopted Max. He emailed Megan explaining what had happened and attaching the file. Her reply came almost immediately, filled with awe and gratitude. "This is incredible," she wrote. "Would you mind if we shared this on our social media? It could help raise awareness about adopting retired working dogs like Max. Daniel hesitated for a moment. He wasn't the type to seek attention, but this wasn't about him. It was about Max and the other dogs like him who needed homes. "Go ahead," he replied. "People need to know what these dogs are capable of." Within hours, the video was online. The shelter's post went viral, racking up thousands of views and shares in just a day. Comments flooded in, praising Max's bravery and marveling at the bond he shared with Daniel. Local news outlets picked up the story, and soon reporters were calling Daniel, asking for interviews. At first he was reluctant. He didn't see himself as a hero. Max was the real star. But when Megan called, urging him to share their story, he agreed. A small news crew came to his house the following day, filming a segment about Max's heroic actions and the extraordinary bond between a veteran and his war dog. Sitting in front of the camera, Daniel felt the weight of the moment. "Max isn't just a dog," he told the reporter. "He's a soldier, a protector, and my best friend. What he did last night wasn't just instinct, it was loyalty. He saved my life in Iraq, and he saved it again here. These dogs aren't just animals, they're heroes." The segment aired that evening, drawing even more attention to Max's story. Messages poured in from viewers, many of them veterans who shared similar experiences with their own service animals. Some were inspired to adopt retired working dogs, while others simply expressed their gratitude for Daniel's service and Max's bravery. A few days later, Daniel received a call from an organization that paired veterans with retired working dogs. They wanted to feature Max as a symbol of their mission. Daniel agreed, proud that Max's story could inspire others. As the weeks passed, life returned to a new kind of normal. And Tehel felt a renewed sense of purpose, not just because of the attention their story had received, but because Max was by his side. The house no longer felt empty. The nights were no longer restless. For the first time in years, Tehel felt whole. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel sat on the porch with Max, watching the sky turn shades of orange and purple. "You know," he said, scratching Max behind the ears, "I think we've got some good years ahead of us." Max let out a contented sigh, leaning into Daniel's touch. The world wasn't perfect, but in that moment, it felt close enough. Together, they had faced war, loss, and uncertainty, and together, they had found their way home.